The Subcommittee on Civil Rights and Human Services will come to order. Welcome, everyone. Our apologies for the delay. We did have votes on the floor. I note that a quorum is present, and I note for the subcommittee that Mr. Yarmouth of Kentucky is permitted to participate in today's hearing with the understanding that his questions will come only after all members of the Subcommittee on Civil Rights and Human Services on both sides of the aisle who are present have had an opportunity to question the witnesses. The committee is meeting today in a legislative hearing to hear testimony on strengthening federal support to end youth homelessness. Pursuant to Committee Rule 7C, opening statements are limited to the chair and the ranking member. This allows us to hear from our witnesses sooner and provides all members with adequate time to ask questions. I recognize myself now for the purpose of making an opening statement. We are here today to discuss our responsibility to provide every child and youth with a safe and stable environment to learn and grow. Today, millions of youth across the country do not have access to a stable home. For many of them, the effects of homelessness are not isolated to days or weeks or months. Youth homelessness has long-term consequences that undermine their education, their safety, and their future. As our witnesses will establish, youth who do not have access to the support and resources that come with stable housing are far more likely to drop out of school, fall prey to exploitation and human trafficking, and remain homeless as adults. In 1974, Congress recognized its responsibility to support youth who lack a safe and stable home by passing the Runaway and Homeless Youth Act. Over the last 4 decades, Congress has repeatedly recommitted on a largely bipartisan basis to fund the law's programs to make sure that runaway and homeless youth receive the services they need to transition out of homelessness and thrive as self-sufficient individuals. Unfortunately, it's been more than a decade since Congress updated the Runaway and Homeless Youth Act. Since then, new research shows that youth homelessness is a public health crisis that demands a significant and thorough response. Researchers have found that over a 12-month period, more than 1 in 30 youth between the ages of 13 and 17 and 1 in 10 youth between 18 and 25 will experience homelessness. One of the counties I represent in Northwest Oregon, Washington County, has reported cases of youth homelessness in the thousands. We also know that factors associated with the significantly higher risk of youth homelessness reflect the systemic challenges facing underserved communities, including family conflict, child abuse, and experience with the juvenile justice and foster care systems. It is no surprise, then, that some youth experience homelessness at disproportionately higher rates. LGBTQ youth, for example, are at a 120% greater risk of entering homelessness compared to heterosexual or cisgender peers. Racial discrimination also contributes to disproportionate homelessness among Black and Latino youth. Black youth have an 83% higher risk of experiencing homelessness than their white peers, and Latino youth have a 33% higher risk. Homelessness can also put youth at high risk for devastating experiences that can have long-lasting consequences on their development. Homeless youth are vulnerable to exploitation and coercion. The data show that 1 in 5 homeless youth are victims of human trafficking. I'm going to say that sentence again. The data show that 1 in 5 homeless youth are victims of human trafficking. 1 in 6 are sexually assaulted or raped. Homeless youth who experience these unspeakable acts need comprehensive supports to process their trauma and rebuild their lives. Our deeper understanding of the causes and factors surrounding youth homelessness demand an updated approach to addressing this public health issue. As this committee considers a bipartisan reauthorization of the Runaway and Homeless Youth Act, we must make sure that federal programs engage and unite family members, a proven approach to transitioning youth into a safe and stable housing when it is in the best interest of the child. Adopt trauma-informed practices that support youth whose experiences have had long-lasting effects on their mental health and well-being. And finally, importantly, that they do not discriminate against youth based on age, race, religion, gender identity, or sexual orientation. Including these provisions in federal programs will help prevent children from having to experience the uncertainty and the trauma of homelessness. Today's hearing takes an important step toward achieving our shared goal of making sure that all children have access to safe and stable housing that empowers them to reach their full potential. And I now recognize the distinguished ranking member for the purpose of making an opening statement.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, for yielding. There are few aspects of a child's development as influential as the home they grow up in. For homeless and runaway youth, there are devastating dangers and risks that can compromise their safety and health. Sadly, reports indicate that in the United States, around 700,000 youth are without homes. Congress reauthorized the Runaway and Homeless Youth Act in 2018, which helps continue efforts to prevent childhood homelessness and rescue youth runaways. The Runaway and Homeless Youth Act, 3 main programs offer crisis intervention such as temporary shelter, counseling, and family unification for runaway and homeless youth. Additionally, the programs support community-based organizations that provide homeless youth with stable and safe longer-term housing. The RHYA also funds outreach and education programs for runaway and homeless youth who have been subjected to serious trauma like sexual abuse and human trafficking. This work is life-saving for young Americans facing homelessness. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, which we will hear from today, also helps save and protect missing youth, including runaway youth. The center's work is just one example of the multifaceted effort to protect youth. By engaging with corporations, law enforcement, nonprofit organizations, and families, the National Center for Missing and Exploiting Children also helps bring kids back home. Increasingly, children cared for by the state are running away, ending up homeless. While we'll hear today that there's a better coordination to help locate these kids and get them back home, there's more work that can be done. There isn't a simple solution for youth homelessness. Children leave home for a lot of reasons. Some run from abuse, but others are lured by predators looking to harm children. That is why we need to help the folks on the ground, the people we will hear from today, to do their jobs. Our children are this country's most valuable asset. They are also the most vulnerable in our society. As lawmakers, we must help protect American youth from homelessness and the dangers it presents. Today's hearing will give us an opportunity to learn more about the programs serving our runaway and homeless youth. I look forward to the testimony from all of our witnesses, and I yield back.
Thank you very much for your statement, Ranking Member. Without objection, all other members who wish to insert written statements into the record may do so by submitting them to the committee clerk electronically in Microsoft Word format by 5 p.m. on July 29th. And I will now introduce our witnesses. We're fortunate to have a distinguished panel. Dr. Matthew Morton is a research fellow at Chapin Hall at the University of Chicago with expertise in youth homelessness, youth development, and evidence-based practice. He is the principal investigator of Voices of Youth Count, the most comprehensive national research initiative to date focused on youth homelessness in America. Dr. Morton held previous positions at the World Bank, the U.S. government, in philanthropy, and with youth-serving nonprofits. While working in the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, he was a key contributor in the development of the U.S. government's national strategy and framework to end youth homelessness. Dr. Melinda Giovanni, was I close? Giovanni? I'm Italian, I should know that, right? Is the executive director of youth care in Seattle, Washington. She has 30 years of experience in developing and implementing re-engagement programs for out-of-school and homeless youth. Melinda holds a MA in clinical psychology and a PhD in educational psychology, and is published on issues regarding youth homelessness and the impact of learning disabilities in hard-to-serve populations. She is the board chair of the National Network for Youth and a board member of the National Youth Employment Coalition. Mr. Robert G. Lowry, Jr. is the vice president of the Missing Children Division at the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, where he supervises the organization's response to reports of missing children. Previously, Mr. Lowry spent more than 30 years in public services as a law enforcement officer, as the Assistant Chief of Police for the Florissant, Missouri Police Department, and as commander of the Greater St. Louis Major Case Squad, the oldest and largest multi-jurisdictional homicide task force in the United States. Mr. Lowry has authored several publications, including an investigation and program management guide for law enforcement agencies responding to cases of missing and abducted children, as well as detailed guides promoting strategies for finding long-term missing children and appropriate response protocols for children with special needs who go missing. Finally, Mr. David Baker is a resident of San Diego, California, where he is a support specialist for the YMCA Youth and Family Services Program. As a formerly homeless youth, Mr. Baker advocates for public policy across the nation and represents the boundless potential of underserved youth. He uses his life experience to guide the creation and implementation of realistic solutions to social issues like youth homelessness. His mission is to promote agency, access, and hope for the most vulnerable populations in society. Welcome again to our witnesses. We appreciate all of you for being here today, and we look forward to your testimony. Let me remind the witnesses that we have read your written statements. They will appear in full in the hearing record. Pursuant to Committee Rule 7D and committee practice, each of you is asked to limit your oral presentation to a 5-minute summary of your written statement. And let me remind the witnesses that pursuant to Title 18 of the U.S. Code, Section 1001, it is illegal to knowingly and willfully falsify any statement, representation, writing, document, or material fact presented to Congress, or otherwise conceal or cover up a material fact. Before you begin your testimony, please remember to press the button on the microphone in front of you so it will turn it on and the members can hear you. And as you begin to speak, the light in front of you will turn green. After 4 minutes, the light will turn yellow to signal that you have 1 minute remaining. When the light turns red, your 5 minutes have expired, and we ask you to please wrap up. And we will let the entire panel make their presentations before we move to member questions. When answering a question, please remember to once again turn on your microphone. And I first recognize Dr. Morton.
Thank you, Chairwoman Bonamici, Ranking Member Comer, and members of the committee for the opportunity to join this important hearing. My name is Dr. Matthew Morton, and I'm a researcher with Chapin Hall at the University of Chicago. I lead Voices of Youth Count, the most comprehensive research initiative to date focused on youth homelessness in America. This research was designed in response to the Runaway and Homeless Youth Act, through which Congress called for replicable national prevalence and incidence estimates of youth homelessness and data concerning the population's needs and characteristics. I also have a family background of lived experience. I lost my parents at a young age and grew up with a great deal of turbulence at home. I had brief runaway experiences, but I was lucky. Teachers, coaches, and others saw potential in me, and they helped me to realize that potential in spite of my adversities. Others, like my little sister, are not so lucky. Their adversities escalate to enduring crisis and homelessness, and many of them remain invisible. Good data can help make the invisible visible. Evidence can help us know where and how to make things better for all our nation's youth. As long as millions of youth do not live up to their potential as individuals, we don't live up to our potential as a nation. Chapin Hall's first nationally representative survey of youth homelessness surfaced alarming conclusions. We found that 1 in 30 adolescents, ages 13 to 17, endures some form of homelessness within a 12-month period. With young adults, ages 18 to 25, the prevalence climbs even higher. 1 in 10 young adults reported some form of homelessness within a year. Moreover, the prevalence rates were statistically equal between rural and non-rural communities. As a share of the population, youth homelessness is just as much of a problem in rural America as it is elsewhere. Our research also shows that not all youth share the same likelihood of facing homelessness. Youth of color have significantly higher homelessness prevalence as compared to their white non-Hispanic peers. Rates are especially high among American Indian, Alaska Native youth, and among African American youth. Our data also show that young people identifying as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, LGBTQ face a 120% increased risk of homelessness. In addition to demographic disproportionalities, certain experiences indicate increased risk for homelessness. The single factor that we found most strongly correlated with higher risk for homelessness among young adults was the lack of a high school diploma. These young people had more than 4.5 times the risk of homelessness as young adults who attained at least a high school level of education. Further, youth experiencing homelessness had disproportionately been in foster care and had spent time in juvenile detention, jail, or prison. Our research also sheds light on connections between youth and family homelessness. For one thing, a large share of youth experiencing homelessness are parents themselves, struggling with housing instability while caring for young children. Moreover, nearly all young people link the beginning of their homelessness to earlier disruptions of family and home, including family homelessness and entry into foster care. For youth, homelessness is about more than the loss of housing. It is about the lack or loss of relationships and connections that others can rely on more consistently for support, safety, and stability. In fact, a startling 35% of youth reported the death of at least one parent or primary caregiver. Housing instability is but one factor that characterizes their journeys, which are typically shaped by significant trauma. We can do better. We can take steps to better respond to youth homelessness and to prevent it. The federal government plays a critical role in supporting data to inform policy in a broad range of areas. Likewise, we encourage Congress to consider its role in enabling the replication of national data on youth homelessness so that we can track our progress toward the goal of ending youth homelessness and tailor strategies accordingly. We cannot end youth homelessness in the dark. Adolescence and young adulthood are key developmental periods in our lives. Every day of housing instability represents missed opportunities to support young people's healthy development so that they can contribute to flourishing communities. We all lose out in these missed opportunities. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony. Dr. Giovanni, 5 minutes for your testimony. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Subcommittee Chair Bonanici and Ranking Member Comer and members of the Subcommittee. My name is Dr. Melinda Javingo, and for over 12 years, I've had the privilege of serving as the CEO of Youth Care, one of the largest providers of youth and young adult experiencing homelessness services in Washington State. I also serve as the board chair for the National Network for Youth. I'm honored to share testimony today about Youth Care's work and our support for the reauthorization of the Runaway and Homeless Youth Act. Founded in 1974, Youth Care was one of the first RHY shelters to serve runaway and homeless youth on the West Coast. We currently serve about 1,500 young people each year and operate a budget of around $17 million. I want to tell you a little bit about Youth Care services and why the reauthorization of the RHY Act is so critical to our mission. First is our focus on minors experiencing homelessness. Across the country, states are grappling with a major system gap: how to support teens who may not meet the threshold of child welfare and dependency, but also cannot return home safely. Youth Care's RHY shelters and transitional living program fill that gap in our community. Our first priority is always family reconciliation, yet reconciliation takes time. For this reason, we support extending the length of stay at the basic center from 21 to 30 days, or longer if it is permitted by licensing in the state. But for a quarter of the youth in our shelters, returning home will not be an option because of issues like abuse, family homelessness, or rejection. This is why Youth Care opened a transitional living program for minors in 1999. We strongly advocate for expanding these programs so that youth are not re-traumatized by having to move from shelter to shelter in order to stay safe. Second, our focus on trafficked youth. Young people living on the streets are at extreme risk for exploitation and trafficking. Youth Care requires all of our staff and all of our employees to attend a 2-day training on the unique needs of sexually exploited youth and has specialized case managers that support young people with histories of trafficking and sexual exploitation. This is also where outreach comes into effect, where we go out in the streets and find these young people before others do. Third, our focus on LGBTQ youth. LGBTQ youth face a higher risk of homelessness. In 1998, Youth Care opened a groundbreaking program for LGBTQ identified young adults, which was and remains the only transitional living program for LGBTQ young adults in Washington state, focused on the affirming young people's gender identity and their sexual orientation. Last, our focus on at-risk or overrepresented populations. Youth Care staff are trained in harm reduction, trauma-informed care, to provide services for populations most at risk of homelessness, including young people of color, young people exiting systems of care, pregnant and parenting youth, and refugee and immigrant young people. Neuroscience has shown that young people's brains do not reach maturation until the age of 25. They are cognitively and emotionally still in formation. Many youth also lack basic employment and life skills. For this reason, strategies, interventions, and outcomes for young people experiencing homelessness must be different than for adults. RHY is the only federal funding source tailored to the unique educational, social, emotional, and housing needs of young people experiencing homelessness. Specifically, RHY's flexible three-pillared model of outreach, shelter, and transitional housing, maternal group homes, allows us to progressively move young people across housing continuums without barriers such as narrow definitions of homelessness and permanent housing used by HUD, which is why, I'll just add, it is so important that you also pass the Homeless Children and Youth Act. Instead, RHY's definition of homelessness and performance outcomes of safe and stable housing, permanent connections, education and employment, and socio-emotional and well-being enable us to design services and capture progress through a lens that is age-appropriate and reflective of generational needs. Which brings me to the reauthorization of RHY. 4.2 million young people in our country are experiencing homelessness. That number is staggering and unacceptable. Without targeting intervention, it also represents a pipeline to chronic adult homelessness. Yet life-saving services are woefully underfunded. RHY's recent funding was $127 million, a mere $30 per young person experiencing homelessness. We can end youth homelessness, but this investment is far from what we need to do so. RHY needs a comprehensive reauthorization, which occurred more than a decade ago, and this must include the non-discrimination and gender-affirming language and support for human trafficking and prevention. Youth Care also supports changing all RHY grant cycles from 3 to 5 years to ensure program stability. Every young person has potential. Unleashing that potential will start with passing of the Runaway and the reauthorization of the Runaway and Homeless Youth Act. I've done this work for more than 35 years. It can be hard, gritty, and yet inspiring every day. What keeps me going, without a doubt, is that we change lives and we save lives. Thank you for letting me share my thoughts, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you for your testimony. Mr. Lowry, I recognize you for 5 minutes for your testimony.
Good afternoon, Chairwoman Bonamici and Ranking Member Comer, and members of the subcommittee. My name is Bob Lowry. I'm the Vice President of the Missing Children Division for the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, or NCMEC. It's an honor to be here today with you to provide NCMEC's perspective on the growing problem of runaway children and discuss our role in helping to quickly resolve cases of runaway children and how we bring them home safely. As a background, NCMEC was created in 1984 by child advocates as a private, nonprofit organization to help find missing children and to reduce child sexual exploitation and to prevent child victimization. Since NCMEC opened its doors, it's been apparent that the most common reason children go missing today is because they run away. NCMEC knows that the runaway crisis is a very real problem, and it creates extremely dangerous situations for our children. Over the past 4 years, 91 to 92% of all missing child reports made today are received by NCMEC are runaways. The average age of a runaway reported in NCMEC is 15 years of age, and more than half of these runaways reported to NCMEC over the past several years have run 3 to 4 times, many of the children dozens of times. NCMEC uses modern tools and technology as well as personalized case manager attention to help find each runaway child reported to us. When we receive a call about a runaway child, we work directly on an individual basis to provide a coordinated response tailored to the particular child. We're child-centric when the reports are made. This approach will include specialized analytical expertise, technical assistance, ongoing support to the parent, guardian who are in crisis, the law enforcement agency responsible for the search and investigation of what happened to the child, the social service agencies working to find the child as well. NCMEC operates a 24-hour-a-day hotline that receives calls each and every day of the year relating to runaway children. Our call center is bilingual, and we have access to third-party interpretation services in nearly 200 languages. We also operate streamlined electronic reporting for social service agencies to enable them to quickly report critical information to NCMEC when a child in foster care runs away. As part of NCMEC's unique intake process for Runaway, we gather specific information and conduct a risk assessment for that individual child. This helps us evaluate if the child has things like social media accounts, which are very prevalent today, or if they've been communicating with anyone online who wish to do them harm, or suffers from other endangerments such as alcohol or drug use, victimization by child sex trafficking, gang recruitment or enticement, pregnancy or other medical conditions that raise their risk, and of course self-harm and suicidal tendencies. Over the past 4 years, 72% of the reported runaways suffered from one or more of these serious endangerments. While NCMEC treats all reports of runaway on an individual basis, we've seen significant increases in the numbers of children who are running from foster care or another form of state care managed by a social service agency. The increase came as a result of Congress's enactment of the Preventing Sex Trafficking and Strengthening Families Act of 2014. The new law requires for the first time that children missing from state care be reported immediately to law enforcement and to NCMEC. We were strong supporters of that law because it enables NCMEC to provide consistent services to previously underserved populations of runaway children. Since the passage of the law, NCMEC reports of children running from state care have nearly tripled. NCMEC has worked tirelessly with state and local social service agencies as well as Health and Human Services and our partner nonprofits to create a streamlined reporting systems and educational programs to share NCMEC's unique expertise and knowledge regarding runaways so we can best protect them. As detailed in my written testimony, NCMEC knows our mission is amplified when we work with public and private partners to help identify and locate runaway children and bring them home safely. NCMEC partners with dozens of technology and social media, retail, and print media companies who help us distribute current images of the child where we geolocate to specific targeted areas where the child may be, which increases our chance of someone in the public recognizing that missing child and reporting it. And we analyze data on online data, so we help determine where our child may be. Well, as I say, most of our children now have social media presence. We can glean lots of information about where they may have gone, who they may be in contact with. We alert the entire community to ensure that the runaway receives the same public attention and concern as any other type of missing child. As NCMEC enters into our 4th decade of working with finding missing children, we know there's a lot more that can be done to help locate and recover runaways and find stable placements to ensure that they do not fall into the cycle of repeated runs and have long-standing detrimental impacts on their health and safety. NCMEC is fortunate to be joined in this mission by the subcommittee and our public and private partners, and we look forward to continuing our work with all of you. Thank you for this opportunity to appear before the subcommittee to discuss this very important topic.
Thank you for your testimony. Mr. Baker, I recognize you for 5 minutes for your testimony.
Good afternoon, Subcommittee Chair Bonamici, Ranking Member Cormier, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for inviting me here today to testify before you. My name is David Baker. I'm a proud Youth Advocacy Council member with the National Network for Youth and a support specialist with the YMCA Youth and Family Services Department in San Diego, California. I came here from San Diego to demonstrate the potential of opportunity youth when given the tools and resources. and to express the value and absolute necessity of federal programs like the Runaway and Homeless Youth Act. I come from a background of intergenerational homelessness, which means my mother was born into homelessness and her mother was also born into homelessness. So access to stable housing was something that my family has never known. The trauma that my mother incurred from her childhood led her to cope with alcohol and drug use. Unfortunately, it seemed there was no place for my mother to address her trauma. The shelter would kick us out for bed rotation at 7 a.m., and it seemed the liquor stores were open by 9. So I would go into school knowing that by the time I got out, my support system would be broken. Due to a lack of resources in our area, housing, financial, and food insecurity plagued my family until at about 16 years old, I understood that there just weren't enough to meet my basic needs, and I ran away. Instead of being a burden to my struggling mother, and this is an extremely common occurrence amongst youth where their living conditions are so bad that they see the streets as a place of opportunity. But what I found in the street was the opposite of opportunity. I found the threat of imprisonment, the threat of trafficking, and the threat of death. Years went by with no diversion opportunities or support offered to me, and I found myself couch surfing as a freshman in college. After hurdling the barriers to receive financial aid as a homeless student, I bought an old car, and that became my home. The back seat was my bedroom, the front seat was my kitchen, and the San Diego County Sheriff was my alarm clock, waking me up every morning to remind me that my safe place was temporary. I completed multiple homeless vulnerability assessments, but came to accept that there just weren't enough housing opportunities for non-foster homeless youth. Also, I didn't want to enter traditional homeless HUD shelters or programs because the trauma of my childhood, I knew what to expect there. And like many homeless youth, I found my car as a safer alternative. This living situation continued until I received a call just a few days before my 22nd birthday from a TLP through the YMCA. It's amazing to think that if I had just been a few days older, I would have been led to continue sleeping in a place that isn't suitable for human habitation. This opportunity completely changed the trajectory of my life. In this TLP, I found myself surrounded by trauma-informed professionals who genuinely wanted the best for me. For the first time ever, I had a support system that wasn't broken or toxic or damaging to my life in any way, and I was empowered to use my experience as a homeless youth to help my peers, which led to a position within the Y, and today I facilitate workshops across San Diego County that teach youth in our Basic Center transitional living programs to effectively address their trauma. These workshops include skills like emotional regulation, distress tolerance, and thoughtful decision-making, all extremely essential for navigating life with trauma and keeping those kids in their homes. I've also created entrepreneur workshops for our youth that feature a comprehensive look at financial literacy and work readiness. This information was transformative for me, and I'm grateful to be sharing these tools. And it's amazing to see the resiliency and growth of youth in our programs, but I know we're just scratching the surface. There are so many of us who need these programs, but just don't have the access because of the federal investment being so small compared to what is needed. Please know that every dollar that you invest tells a young person like me that their dreams and their goals matter, and they're valuable, and they should have the opportunity to flourish. When you invest in us, our entire society benefits, and you can see me as a living example of that. Through programs funded by the Runaway and Homeless Youth Act, I was given a foundation to build a life of prosperity. I was given a chance to change my family history forever. Today, I ask you to please make that a possibility for every youth, because they deserve it. Before, I was a youth in the street with no resolution in sight, but today I'm so much more than that. I'm a taxpayer, I am an exceptional entrepreneur, and last but certainly not least, I'm an advocate. Thank you all again for allowing me to speak.
Thank you so much for all of you for your very powerful testimony. Under Committee Rule 8A, we will now question the witnesses under the 5-minute rule, and as chair, I'll start and be followed by the ranking member, and then we'll alternate between the parties. And I'm going to start with Dr. Giovanni. Homeless youth are at an increased risk for trafficking and sexual exploitation. A study by researchers at the University of Pennsylvania and Loyola University found that 1 in 5 homeless youth were victims of human trafficking, and girls as young as 10 years old had been forced into sex trade. Many children have no way out because their traffickers use physical force and intimidation to keep them from seeking help. So how has your organization used staff trainings, you mentioned in your written testimony, and leveraged the partnerships with local organizations to help identify and serve victims of trafficking? And how can Congress support these efforts to protect children and youth from trafficking and exploitation?
Thank you. I want to say that Youth Care was actually started to really address the issue of sexual exploitation in Seattle. And so we have always been very aware of the issue in our community. Currently, we run a program called the Bridge Continuum, which is exactly what you described as a multidisciplinary, multi-agency intervention strategy to help young people who have been trafficked through street outreach, through specially trained advocates, and through partnerships with trauma-informed care therapists, substance abuse specialists, workforce development specialists. We've been able to create a wraparound service model for these young people that is not just a standalone model. It's a model that has lived inside of our Runaway and Homeless Youth programs for 40 years, and we've actually expanded that in our community and around the state of Washington in replicating that model in other communities. So I think that it's important for folks to understand that the Runaway and Homeless Youth programs, basic centers, outreach, and transitional living programs are our first line of prevention for these young people who are being trafficked, and they can be, and like at Youth Care, all of our staff, everyone, including my accounting staff, are trained in the recognition and the services needed for helping these young people exit the streets and getting into a safe and stable environment.
Terrific, thank you so much. Dr. Morton, currently the 2 federal agencies collecting data on the prevalence of child or youth homelessness are the Department of Housing and Urban Development and the Department of Education, but counts of homeless youth vary widely across these 2 agencies. For example, HUD's point-in-time count identified 168,267 homeless youth in 2017, yet your study identified 4.2 million homeless youth. So how do each of these agencies collect data on youth homelessness, and what definition does each agency use to decide whom to include in their counts, and why is it so important that the counts of homeless youth include those who are doubled up? What can Congress do to make sure that we're getting the highest quality data on the prevalence of runaway and homeless youth?
Thank you, Chairwoman. These different counts and estimates serve different purposes. HUD's counts are meant to capture primarily shelter and street-based homelessness on a specific night. Education captures reported homelessness over the course of the year. Both are different forms of capturing homelessness as they're presented to a system, largely, whereas a nationally representative survey like the one we did does not depend on the young people that emerge to a system or that are formally reported or identified visibly in the streets. This is important because much of youth homelessness is hidden. We find that young people experience many different forms of homelessness and housing instability over a period of time. They can come in and out of homelessness, and this is different than what we see with older adult chronic homelessness, for example. And to be able to capture that hiddenness, it's important to capture the full spectrum of young people's experiences, and not just at one point in time, but over a period of time. And this is why we've taken this particular approach to complement the data that we get about young people coming into systems and services through education and HUD.
Thank you for your work. And I'm going to yield back the balance of my time. I recognize Ranking Member Comer for his questions, and recognize Representative Stefanik from New York for 5 minutes for her questions, and Representative Hayes is going to take over for me. I yield back. Representative Stefanik.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I represent one of the most rural districts on the East Coast. I represent 194 towns and villages. It takes about 5 hours from one side to the other of my district. And homelessness in rural communities is different, and the resources are different than homelessness in urban and suburban communities. So my questions are going to focus on how we can address this challenge in rural communities and what specific solutions we have for rural America. So first, Dr. Morton, the Voices of Youth count indicates that homelessness is almost as common in rural areas as it is in urban areas, at least for youth and young adults. Can you tell us if these percentages hold true for other age groups? And what are some of the unique aspects of helping to provide services for the homeless and prevention services in rural communities?
Thank you, Congresswoman. It's a very good question and a very important issue to highlight. We do find with our data that youth homelessness is just as prevalent as a share of the population in rural communities as it is in non-rural communities. Now, there are more youth experiencing homelessness in urban communities because there are more people living in urban communities, but as a share of the population, it is just as much of a challenge in rural communities. At the same time, it doesn't necessarily look the same in rural communities as you allude to. Young people are about twice as likely to be couch surfing, staying with others. In rural communities, they're even more likely to be literally homeless on the streets or in places not meant for human habitation in rural communities, and they're about half as likely to be staying in shelters, often because those shelters don't exist. In rural communities, they're inaccessible or they're not youth-specific. So this underscores the need for much more creative and resourced outreach efforts and working across public systems and services and community-based organizations that could be coming into contact with young people.
Do you or does anyone on the panel have examples of particularly effective outreach efforts in rural communities? Because the access is an issue, transportation is an issue, hunger in rural areas is an issue too, and that's very much tied to the challenge of homelessness. Does anyone have best practices you'd like to highlight?
Well, this is Dr. Javingo speaking, and I think that one of the things we have seen in Washington State and some of our rural communities are really the gathering of local resource providers to kind of create what I would call a virtual one-stop for young people, and reaching into the schools early and often to make sure that we're identifying those young people who are experiencing homelessness. Obviously, faith-based organizations have stepped up in many communities. In one community in Washington State, Whidbey Island, we have a very extensive model of host homes where the community has gone out and found community providers to help community people to actually help house young people in emergency situations. So I think that there are unique challenges, but most of it is getting the information consistently out in places where we know young people are, and even in rural areas, schools probably are the best way we can reach them early, and we need to start before the crisis hits so that before they drop out, they know how to get homelessness resources when the crisis hits.
And Mr. Lowry, I wanted to ask specifically about different protocols or actions taken to help find someone who goes missing in a rural community rather than if they go missing in an urban or suburban community.
Well, yes, there are differences in our approach to that, but of course, all missing children are pretty much treated the same. What we look for is we do a risk assessment anytime a child goes missing, and pretty much can give us an idea where that child may have gone. And oftentimes, especially with our runaway children, there's a specific place that they might go or specific individuals they may be with. But oftentimes, though, we find that some of our children are despondent, maybe suffering from some mental illnesses and things, which does make that challenge much more challenging for us when it goes to that search. So at the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, we have protocols for searching rural areas, which is a different protocol than you say searching suburban or densely populated urban areas. So we will send those representatives on site to work with the sheriff's office or the local agencies to aid them in the rescue of that child. We'll have them there usually within just a few hours. For us, a missing child is a missing child, and they go missing for a variety of reasons. The only difference that we do see in rural areas is that I think every area struggles with resources for these children, especially after they've been found. And rural areas, I think, certainly suffers from that phenomenon.
Thank you. Yield back.
Thank you. I now recognize the committee chairman, Mr. Scott from Virginia.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. And I want to thank all of our witnesses for being with us today. Mr. Baker, you indicated that we need to make investments in young people to make sure they're not homeless. Exactly what do you mean? What should we be investing in?
I believe just ensuring that these funds are available for these innovative programs. So the TLPs, the basic centers, and especially those outreach teams to ensure that they have everything that they need to get the job done. Youth homelessness and youth struggle as a whole comes in many different unique forms, and every single individual's need is as unique as their character is. So ensuring that the money, the blood of it all is available so that these folks can access these services and overcome their barriers wherever they may be.
Well, if you find the homeless and provide emergency services, you still need to do something to deal with the underlying problem. What should we be doing? Dr. Giovanna, do you want to ask what should we be doing to deal with the underlying problem?
Thank you for the question. I would say that youth homelessness is way more than just a house and a roof over a young person's head, and we must address the issue from a 360 perspective. Young people, we will not end youth homelessness unless we are partnering with the education and employment systems to get these young people back on kind of traditional pathways so that they can become self-sufficient. It's very different than an adult who has had life experiences with housing and jobs. Giving a young person just a place to live is not enough. We have to be able to provide them with the education, employment, mental health, health care, and really support to become a full individual and understand what their needs are and how they can build their own talents and scope moving forward.
Okay, you mentioned education. Is an on-campus educational experience one of the solutions?
I think for some young people it is. I mean, we run drop-in schools. We also have, we run a youth build program that is an employment and training program for homeless young people. We run prevention services inside of on-campus educational facilities to help young people stay in school and help their families from going homeless so they don't lose school. So I think being at all points where a young person can begin to drop away from mainstream systems is critical in order to prevent them from ending up in a chronic state of homelessness.
Now, on-campus educational experience would probably be after high school. What could we do before high school graduation?
Well, I think being in those post-secondary, being in high schools is critical. Running programs like National Safe Place in communities, which gives young people resources when they first think about running away into access. On campus, I do think that we need to address the post-secondary access to housing. One of the things we see, and I've dropped many a young person off at college, and the first question they ask me when I start to leave is, where do I go at Thanksgiving? And you will find young people end up in a crisis situation at those natural juncture points where they don't have any place to live and the campus is shut down. So we have to think about how we're going to support young people who do not have traditional families and or friends to be able to go home to during those break periods and give them the pocket money and things that we would give our own children to be able to fit in and be normalized in that situation.
When they shut down the campus over Thanksgiving, that sounds like something we can do, work with the college. I mean,
Absolutely.
That shouldn't be a problem. Are there peculiar challenges when you talk about parenting, either the child or the homeless older child who has a child herself? Is that a unique challenge?
Well, absolutely. I mean, to be honest with you, we need more maternal care group homes for young people, and especially for minors who have children. Right now, there are very, very few places for a 17-year-old to go with an infant child. And just recently, we had a young person that was living in her car on Monday, and on Tuesday stayed with a friend, and on Thursday was back in her car, and had a housing assessment through the HUD definition and wasn't eligible because she'd stayed with her mom one night. And the night before she'd been safe. So we have to think about how we are preventing young people from accessing the services, especially these young families, and especially these young women. And I would say that putting those young parents into adult systems is not helpful because you're talking about a child parenting a child. And we actually have to help the young person who is the parent learn the skills to be self-sufficient on their own, as well as help coach them through parenting a very young infant.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. I now recognize the ranking member of the committee, Ms. Fox from North Carolina.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Mr. Lowry, thanks to all the witnesses for being here. Mr. Lowry, this hearing's about the federal runaway and homeless youth programs. However, in addition to learning about the work done under these programs, we thought it was important to highlight the work done to help a child when they're missing because they ran away. Can you discuss why it is important to focus on what we do to help bring the child home as much as on providing services if they're experiencing homelessness or preventing them from leaving home in the first place?
Thank you, Ms. Fox, and I think you're absolutely correct, and we agree that all children, either homeless or runaway, are in crisis, and that we know that it's very important that we intervene as quickly as we can when that child is reported missing. We do work with homeless shelters all over the U.S. When a child goes missing from those shelters, but in general, we also work with all runaway children, and even one of those children are in crisis, and we have to get them back as quickly as we can. But hence, this is where it becomes the issue, is that while finding the children is something that we do each and every day, but that's only half the battle. It's keeping them in those safe places so they're encouraged not to leave there, and they stay in a safe environment. And this is the challenge that we face each day. And we depend on our partners, our other NGOs and nonprofits out there that provide services for these families and these children, so that they're encouraged not to run away and find themselves in harm. And as I testified earlier, many of our children don't run just once, they run multiple times. And each and every time we can tell that with increasing severity of the risk that these children face. So we know that we need early interventions, and sometimes that we find that those sources are not always available as we need them.
Mr. Lowry, I want to follow up. You mentioned the need to evolve in your work to continue helping to find missing children. Can you explain this in more detail and share some examples of what this has looked like over time? And finally, what harm can occur if you're not constantly evaluating and improving your methods?
Yes, thank you, Ms. Fox. That's an excellent question. You know, in our 35 years of existence, you know, we found it essential that we're constantly evaluating the work that we're doing. We're evaluating trends because a lot's changed in those 35 years since we first opened our doors. You know, the behaviors of children have changed. The behavior of offenders has changed. We're seeing social media now as ingrained in our culture. As one good example is nearly all of our children have some social media presence. And while we find social media to be a wonderful tool and a wonderful part of our daily lives, and it's helped us when it comes to finding, locating, and recovering children, it also has those that use that platform for nefarious purposes by luring our children, engaging them in conversations that are inappropriate, and eventually convincing those children to go along with them. We've entered into an age now that we have to be very, very on guard. We have to learn from those experiences, and we know as a center that constant evaluation on how we can get better. So we work with our technology partners that we have at the National Center. We have availabilities of some of the best in the world that help us with those very issues and how we can identify those kids. So to your point, ma'am, is that yes, the world has changed, and we have to stay at our best when it comes to protecting our children.
And one more question, Mr. Lowry. Your testimony talked about work being done to prevent a child from running away again. What are some of the things the center does to help families keep those children home? Are there workshops the center puts together for local organizations and families to help know what to watch for or be concerned about what may lead to a child running away again?
Yes, ma'am. As a matter of fact, I'm very glad you asked that question because this is something that we pride ourselves in, because we know that as finding these children is as important as the prevention work that we must do to keep them safe. Because if we can keep a child and discourage them from running, we know that child's going to live a long, prosperous life. We have discussion guides that have been developed at the National Center that we share with parents and guardians on recognizing early warning signs of when a child may be susceptible to wanting to run away or escape an environment may be detrimental to them, and what they might do and how they would intervene with that child. With third parties they could engage to help them before that child goes. And as importantly is we have guides, that guide also guides parents that if the worst should happen and that child goes missing, what they need to do. And what they really need to do is they need to report immediately, because time is the enemy when children are missing, and we need to act as quickly as we can and mobilize to get those children back. every missing child is important to us, but keeping them safe is the challenge that we face each day. There are no waiting periods when it comes to missing children. We remind parents of that each and every day and report immediately. The other thing I want to point out is that we have a lot of online safety guides that protect children when they're using these electronic platforms, and it's age-appropriate material that can be found on the website at the National Center that can be shared with children. And we share that information also in schools with educators so that children are taught that while we have some wonderful things available to us today, there are some inherent dangers that our children just need to be aware of and how to avoid that.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Thank you. I now recognize Ms. Schreier from Washington.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you to all of our witnesses. I was so impressed by all of your testimonials, and I have a couple questions. First, Dr. Morton, thank you for laying out all the different ways that these kids and young adults are counted, because there are vast differences. And Dr. Giovengo, I wanted to let you know that I was in Auburn at a temporary living shelter for homeless youths aged, I believe it's up to age 18. On the same day that King County released their remarkable homeless count, which showed a dramatic decrease from the year prior, and all the people sitting around the table said, that's complete baloney. We all know that because we know where these kids are on the streets. We drove the neighborhoods the night before, and the night of the count, they weren't there. And they theorized that perhaps they were handed bus tickets out of town, that perhaps they were caught up in the criminal justice system. And I wondered if either one of you could maybe speak to the intersection between homeless youth and the criminal justice system, and then I'll get to another question.
Sure. Thank you very much, Congresswoman. So we do know that there is a significant overlap between juvenile and criminal justice involvement and the experience of youth homelessness. In fact, 46% of young people experiencing homelessness on a specific night that we surveyed across 22 counties had been in juvenile detention, prison, or jail. And that's not even counting other forms of contact with the criminal justice system. It doesn't mean that all young people exit these systems directly into homelessness, but it does mean that, like youth in child welfare, like youth in behavioral health systems, this is a population that is at significant risk and in need of additional screening to look for risk factors or situations of housing instability, and to align appropriate supports and services, and to collaborate with these young people themselves so that they can teach us what types of solutions make the most sense for them.
I would agree with Dr. Morton. In King County in particular, Youth Care does exceptional work inside of juvenile detention to prevent young people from exiting on the streets. As far as the count goes, the one-night count in January at 2 in the morning, you're probably not going to see a lot of young people anyway. But on the positive side, Washington State has done some remarkable investment through the Office of Homeless Youth in terms of addressing the issue of minors experiencing homelessness, which is where we saw the biggest drop. And that included expanding beds, i.e. more basic center beds, more basic center opportunities, more outreach opportunities to find those young people and get them reattached, and to actually, begin early with family intervention, family supports, family reconciliation, which is the primary really target of all of the RHY services. As soon as we see a young person, it's about getting them back to family. A family is safe and stable, and so we try to do that immediately. But targeted resources help, and I think we've seen some of that in Washington State.
Thank you. I had a question about resources, because that same temporary shelter said that for a year, and this is just my memory here, it was in the tens of thousands of dollars for each young person they had there. And I'm looking at what federal funding is, and I'm hearing the number $30 per homeless youth per year, and I'm embarrassed that I'm even sitting here having this discussion, because it is nothing what the federal government is providing. I'm wondering what your other funding sources are and what more we can do, or whether there are other federal programs that overlap that help these kids.
Sure, I think that is really important, because the Runaway and Homeless Youth Act is kind of the anchor point in communities, and that's why every community should have a runaway and homeless youth point program. When we have an RHY program, we can then leverage that $3 and $4 to 1 through our state dollars, sometimes, not so much anymore, but occasionally through HUD, through our Workforce Investment Act dollars, through our local homelessness dollars, through private philanthropy, and really create comprehensive services. At youth care, each bed for an under 18 young person costs bed, not per child, but each bed that we keep open on each night is about $55,000 a year because of licensing and licensing requirement, which are critical, and in order to provide a high quality of care, making sure that young person is getting to school, getting to workforce development, doing family reconciliation, having access to mental health and substance disorder treatment. All of that, comes into a basic center in order to meet the developmental needs of young people, and it's really critical. The federal investment needs to be much higher. I'm not going to, let everyone off the hook there, but it is only part of the solution, but it does provide the anchor in a community and the philosophy of how we should be addressing these needs in communities.
Thank you. Thank you to all of you. And then I've run out of time, but I will submit questions for you, Mr. Baker, in terms of what services were most helpful to you and what would you like to see more investments in. Thank you to all of you.
Thank you. I now recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Ranking Member, thank you for this, for this hearing on an incredibly important topic. It is, it's rather sad what happens to kids, to our children. We see that manifest itself in so many ways, whether it's whatever the issues are. A lot today, obviously, with escalation with substance abuse, opioid abuse, but a breakdown of the family. Sometimes, the impact of poverty for what occurs for whatever reason. And so I really appreciated hearing all of your testimony. I apologize I had to step out. Actually hosting a hearing on Tuesday's children and had to get kicked off. And but I was here for your testimony, and I appreciate the experience and the compassion that each of you bring to this hearing. Ms. Lowry, thank you for being here and taking time of your busy schedule. As you know, the Runaway, Homeless, and Youth Act aims to end childhood homelessness and rescue youth runaways. And during the 2017-2018 school year, my home state, Pennsylvania Public Schools, totaled 4,101 unaccompanied homeless youth. That's not acceptable. Our children are this country's most valuable asset, and unfortunately, they're also the most vulnerable in our society. So, Ms. Lowry, given your work with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, how does the center interact with homeless shelters and organizations that work to provide safety services to homeless and runaway youth, and are there improvements to those interactions you'd like to make?
Well, thank you, Mr. Thompson, and thank you for that question. And exactly what we do at the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, we do interact with those homeless shelters, whether it's family youth shelters, whether they're group homes or they're just drop-in facilities. We take reports now because of our work with the Children Missing from Care Initiative, which is under the Preventing Sex Trafficking and Strengthening Families Act, requires that they be reported. So we're interacting with agencies in all 50 states now and all regions of the United States when it comes to missing children. And of course, when you're talking about homeless children, it exasperates the problem when they run away from that environment, because oftentimes, as you say, they are the most vulnerable children that we have in our society today. There are those that are waiting for them, luring them from that environment, luring them into things such as horrendously into child sex trafficking. Gangs target these children for recruitment or affiliations so that they can carry out some of the things for the gangs. So we're seeing all sorts of victimization with these children as well. Sexual exploitation, but sexual and violent victimization is also something else that we don't find to be uncommon with all of our runaway children. But I think you bring up another point, is what we would like to see in a perfect world would be when we find these children, we can return them to a safe place. Oftentimes that we're going to find that those children are going to simply walk away. and continue their cycle of running away. And it's a very frustrating issue for us. As I said, the finding the children is only half of the work that we have to do. It's how do we keep them there? And oftentimes we're lacking services and those important interdictions to show these children that there's a better life for them out there than what they're seeking or what they're being encouraged to do by those who are taking advantage of their situation. And I think this is where, if we had anything, I would believe that would be what we would really wish for.
So what type of services, you mentioned just in general, you'd like to see the services that would be instrumental in facilitating that? What type of services in particular would it be, would be good to be able to expand or to improve upon?
Well, and that's an excellent question. I think what we'd like to see is more services directly to that child and their family, so that we can keep them together and strengthen that position so that the child isn't in a position where they find the circumstances undesirable, or maybe there's circumstances within the home that need to be improved. I think Mr. Baker made some very excellent points about his own situation that really exemplifies the points that I'm making. Because oftentimes our children are running because they're seeking a better life for themselves. They have a lack of self-worth sometimes that they are running from a situation. So the more that we can get interventions for those children, help them improve their lives, the better I think we'll serve that population of kids. But as I said, sometimes we do find that some places have adequate services and many others do not.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. I now recognize Mr. Johnson from South Dakota.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Lowry, we'll keep on with you. And I thought you did a good job in your testimony talking about the role of technology and how it can be used by predators to make children more susceptible to running away. So are there data or statistics that can help us get a better sense of how acute or pervasive this problem is?
Well, yes, we can provide you some more additional information. I don't have that with me here today. But I can tell you that is that our experience at the National Center is most children today have some sort of online presence. The social media and the availability of smartphone technology and computers for children now has made our world, frankly, a better place. But there's also an area where predators are seeking our children for victimization. We're seeing cases now where they're making contact with our children in online chat rooms or on social media apps. And then these conversations might take place over periods of days, weeks, months, and until they've gained the confidence of that child.
Almost a grooming process.
Absolutely, it's a grooming process, and this is something that we're extremely concerned with, because then our children are being coerced into doing something they would not normally do, and that's go with those offenders. Too often that when these reports are made, because it doesn't present itself to law enforcement, the officer taking the report sees that child as a runaway, and we think it's something more than that, so we dig deeper into that.
So is there something that NCMEC is using? Are there something families can be doing to help push back against this negative influence of technology?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, we specifically target our families with information about how social media and how that interacts with our children, both good and bad. There's safety material on there as well. But at the same time is that we remind parents that they are the first line of defense when it comes to their children. Oftentimes we find that children are reluctant to share information with their parents because of the inappropriateness of the conversations in which they've been engaged. So we remind parents, do not be judgmental when it comes to your child. There's one villain in this story, and it's not the youth.
Well, and at least for me as the father of 3 young sons, I mean, if I only bring up these topics once a year as sort of the big scary conversation, then people have a tendency to clam up. The more regularly that I can integrate some of these conversations about how do you make good decisions, how do you take care of yourself, how do you make sure your friends are making good decisions, then it seems more like just a part of a good conversation between a parent and a child. Does that sound about right?
And I think you bring up a point too, is it's not necessarily bad parenting, it's just the fact that we're living in a social media world that's a culture that's way. and that while we're parenting in a world that's dominated by social media, we're frankly policing in an area that's dominated by social media. So it's gaining that understanding. Frankly, someone my age didn't have the understanding until, of course, I've been in this job, that, say, my grandson would have. They're far more keen to how this technology evolves and how they can utilize this technology to communicate with their friends, communicate with their siblings. So oftentimes, we find that the parents are not always the best source of information when it comes to this. When we know that a child has run away and we can't explain why, we're going to be speaking with the siblings. We're going to be seeking their friends. What is their online presence? And it's not always apparent when we get those initial reports. That's why we dig in and do a very comprehensive risk assessment.
So my district, the entire state of South Dakota, has 9 reservations, as well as tens of thousands of Native peoples living on and off reservation. Does NCMEC have particular resources that they're deploying to Indian country that can help with this issue?
Well, absolutely. We're in Indian country quite frequently. We have programs not only with Amber Alert. Frankly, I was in Arizona and New Mexico recently helping the Navajo Nation establish their Amber Alert program. But we're very, very active in our interventions with Indian and tribal communities, which is oftentimes considered to be underserved. The reports of missing children sometimes are sparse, and we encourage the reporting, so we're sharing with their law enforcement agencies and the families not to be hesitant to report their children missing. We're there to help them and provide those services. But we've been very, very active in that regard, especially up in the north.
Well said. Thank you, Mr. Lowry. Thank you, Madam Chair, and I yield back.
Thank you. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. So, welcome to the witnesses. I've heard a lot of things today that really has got me thinking about some things back at home. One of the things, in my hometown in Waterbury, Connecticut, we have the largest homeless youth population in my community. And as an educator, I always saw kids who were transitioning out of high school faced with these challenges. And I reached out this week in preparation for this hearing to our shelter, to some of our community foundations. And one of the things I found out was that we have the largest, let me be more specific, the largest homeless LGBTQ youth population. And part and parcel due to the fact that Waterbury has the largest capacity of homeless shelters. But our homeless shelter assigns anyone who comes according to their identity, their sexual orientation at birth. And many of these young people end up on the street as a result of that. So our community has really just become the place where all of this happens. I guess, Mr. Lowry, is there anything, as we're thinking about that specifically, young people being assigned to dorm-style shelter units by their gender identity at birth, is there any way that we can ensure that youth are getting the services that they need and not going to the streets instead of going to a shelter because of issues like that?
Well, you bring up an excellent point, ma'am. It's the LGBTQ community is obviously a very vulnerable population of children. But when those reports are made, and we get those reports quite frequently of children who run away, the sexual orientation is not really relevant to the work we're doing. We're assessing the risk that child faces instead. So we don't keep this particular data on that population of kids, nor any other population, because race, sex, and sexual orientation is only part of the work that we do. And it's using that information that we have about the individual child to assess the risk that they face. Oftentimes, we know that those children face higher rates of victimization, so that raises that risk level.
But specifically about this, I don't mean to cut you off, I just don't want all my time to run out. Yes, Dr. Giovengo, do you have any information in that specific area?
Yes, at least Youth Care's practices, and I think the practices of most of the RHY programs around the country, is to be gender affirming and supportive of young people. So as they come in, they basically identify the gender that they identify as, and we then assign them beds or units based on their choice and their selection of their self-identity as gender affirming. So,
thank you.
Which I think is really critical for their safety.
Two other things that I want to elevate right now, and I'll ask both of my questions at once so that if we get to the end of the time, at least I will have asked the questions. The first one is, as an educator, we're talking a lot about youth who are of the age to make the choice. I know there's also lots of minors who are homeless youth. And again, in this city where we have the largest homeless shelters, we have a lot of families who are housed there. And what I saw was in the summer, you had a mom who lived in the shelter but had full-time employment. It was on the pathway to stable and secure housing, but because there was no school, they often were forced to quit their jobs because they now had to leave the shelter at 9 a.m. and be out all day and had nowhere to put their children. So I'm going to come back to you, Dr. Morton, on this. Does your research address any of the wraparound services that we can provide for people as they're on the pathway to stable and secure housing, even while they're homeless? And then my next question is something that we touched upon earlier. I've worked so hard as an educator so many times to get kids through our high school system, get them enrolled in college, get them on a campus, and just like you said, when the campuses go on break, these kids are back in a situation and often can't recover. Are on the dean's list, have been doing amazing work, go through the summer and can't return. So again, what are the wraparound services we could provide? So with the remainder of my time, I'd like Dr. Morton and or even Mr. Baker, because you've had some experience here.
Thank you very much, Congresswoman. I'd say that the research certainly reinforces that young people need housing stability, and permanent housing is a basis for success in areas elsewhere, but also underscores the fact that youth homelessness is a product of more than housing instability. It's also about ruptured relationships, a lack of education and ability to connect to a long-term career path with stable income in the context of rapidly increasing housing prices. So all of these connected supports and services are really essential to young people, and that they're offered in a trauma-informed way, and that they establish meaningful long-term connections in the community for young people that they can utilize and engage beyond the life of a specific housing program.
Thank you. Unfortunately, my time has expired, but I just want us all to think about and be reminded that these are, like you said, it's not just the housing, it's all of those connected services and the extension of what happens to these children in our communities. I guess I'm yielding back to myself. I now recognize the ranking member of this subcommittee, Mr. Comer from Kentucky.
Before I begin my questions, Mr. Baker, I just have to say that I was very impressed with your story. You certainly are an inspiration. I'm glad that you serve now as an advocate, because you should be a role model to the youth that we're talking about today. And I just wanted to publicly say that. Mr. Lowry, you took a lot of time to discuss why it's important to consider these kids as missing rather than as runaways or something else. How successful has the center been in getting communities to see that, and what kind of education do you do to help spread that message?
Thank you, Mr. Ranking Member. Yes, what we find is very frustrating is that we face a desensitized and an apathetic public when we advertise the fact that this child was a runaway. In fact, so much so that several years ago we made a conscious decision to remove that designation from our posters when we're facing to the public. Unfortunately, the public doesn't understand the endangerments these children face. So instead, now we embarked on an education program and sharing of information program so that we raise public awareness of the endangerments. And we're seeing progress, although it's coming in increments. We know that also that the public is now starting to recognize that they play a role when it comes to finding our children in our communities. And we also know that the media, frankly, was very difficult for us to get media attention for a child if they knew that that child was a runaway. So we're starting to get better media attention to our children, especially when we start talking to them about that risk that child faces. Okay. So if they're endangered, we're getting much better, and law enforcement's doing a much better job. We've been sharing best practices, recommendations with law enforcement. We encourage rapid response, rapid search that's been adopted. And frankly, I'm working right now with our partners at the International Association of Chiefs of Police to develop model policies for response to missing children that we hope will be soon adopted by most agencies across the country.
Great. A child that's missing is a crisis, no matter where they come from or who they are. However, sometimes it helps to have better information about the child to try to locate them faster. What kind of information is important, and how does the center spread that information out in a useful manner to help local organizations find and bring the child home?
Excellent question. Yes, sir. When we get a report of a missing child, immediately at the time that report's being made, we're taking information from the caller. As I say, we are a child-centric organization, meaning that we don't treat that child as a number, that we treat that child as a person. And each child that goes missing, we know is a unique event. So therefore, we're looking for information on who that child may be with, where they may be heading, why they left the environment that they left. If they've had a social media presence with someone who may have been in contact with them that encouraged them to leave that safe environment. We're also watching very intently on whether or not these gangs are in contact with our kids, encouraging them to come there. And again, these children are especially vulnerable to that kind of contact because they lack that sense of belonging oftentimes, and maybe that sense of self-worth. So they're looking for someone who would look after them or possibly even protect them. Obviously, we know that that's probably not the best choice to be made. But again, we're not in the circumstances of those children. So we've learned from all that through that risk assessment program. Also, each and every child is assigned to one singular case management team at the National Center. So they know that child better than anyone else and the behaviors. So when that child, as I say, goes reported missing more than once, that case manager is going to know where they've been found in the past, who they've been accompanied with. So they're sharing that information with law enforcement and the social service agencies to expediently return that child to a safe place.
My last question I'm going to ask Mr. Baker, is there anything in particular that we in Congress should be aware of as we look at programs to help vulnerable children, or anything you would like to mention that would be helpful for us to know?
Thank you for the question, Ranking Member Comer. I think one thing that Congress should be aware of is the Homeless and Foster Youth Act of 2019. This act would streamline the process for applying for financial aid, receiving financial aid. It would help students access housing, and it would designate a higher education liaison to hold a place for these students to access services. In San Diego, the community college that I went to had an equity office, and that was a place where students could go to get a little sticker on their ID so that they didn't have to self-identify that they were homeless. It also gave us access to showers in the morning, which is essential for somebody who's trying to get themselves together, especially while trying to avoid self-identifying, which is one of the main things that keeps a young person from accessing services. So,
Okay. Well, thank you very much. My time has expired, and I yield back.
Thank you. I now recognize the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Yarmouth.
Thank Chairwoman Hayes and Ranking Member Comer, and also for the witnesses for being here. I'm very grateful to the committee to allow me to participate in today's hearing. I would also like to thank again the witnesses, and I'm here because I'm the lead Democrat on the reauthorization of the Runaway and Homeless Youth and Trafficking Prevention Act, which I'm working to finalize now with Representative Bacon here in the House and with Senators Leahy and Collins in the Senate. This hearing presents a great opportunity to discuss how we can strengthen our RHY programs and work toward ending youth homelessness altogether. Youth homelessness is an issue that I have focused on throughout my time in Congress, and the testimony presented today demonstrates the need for increased support from the federal government in these critical programs. Investing in children is the most important investment we can make in our nation's future, and homeless youth are among the most vulnerable people in our communities. We know that homeless youth are at high risk for developing physical, behavioral, and emotional problems and potentially becoming victims of sex and labor trafficking. Given the right support, we can help these young people effectively transition into adulthood, become competitive in the workforce, and positively contribute to society. Yet 1 in 10 young adults and 1 in 30 adolescents are homeless and in need of services, which clearly exceeds the resources of RHY programs. For the young people who do receive RHY services, the current funding level limits that assistance to $30 per day per young person on average. So we have 2 gaps to fill between those who need services and those who are getting it, and the level of services provided to each young person and what is needed to make sure each individual is safe and set up to succeed, which brings me to my questions. Dr. Giovango, your testimony talks about the importance of extending the grant length from 3 to 5 years. Could you tell us how that change would improve service delivery to young people?
Absolutely. This is something that we're very passionate about in the field because the 3-year grant cycle really keeps our staff on kind of pins and needles about if they're going to have a job. And that constant reauthorization really doesn't allow us to develop, especially young staff, into excellent staff and maintain them over time. People change people. That's what makes a difference in the lives of our young people that we serve. And the better we're able to maintain both the programming, the consistency of the people, and the quality of the people that we have in programs makes a huge difference. A commitment of 3 to 5 years allows us to focus our resources on developing a workforce that are the experts and that can stay committed to the young person. I mean, I submitted a story in my written testimony about a young person that said, 3 years, worked with the same person over 3 years. That's how he got out of homelessness. And so I think that one of the things it allows us to do is stabilize these programs and help build the kind of community sustainability that we need to keep them going in whatever economic times.
Just following up, what would you like to see Congress do other than extend the duration from 3 to 5 years for Congress to do to strengthen these programs?
Well, I think we've talked about the idea of going from 21 to 30 days, and where licensing allows it even longer for young people so that we can actually work on long-term placement for young people, either getting them back home or building more transitional living programs for those minors 16 to 18 years old so that they're not just discharged to another shelter. I think those are two critical pieces, extending the timeline, working on the length of the grant, and of course the level of funding would be critical. I mean, we need way more than $127 million to have an RHY program in every community. And I think Congress needs to recognize the cost of dealing with minors and licensing and having quality services. Helping young people regain their lives, ending homelessness, is an expensive undertaking, and I would say that we turn away young people, every day and all across this country. And, just as a saying, traffickers don't have wait lists. So when they can't be served by us and when we don't have a resource in a community, someone's right there waiting for them, and we need to be there to ensure that these young people's lives are not destroyed and trauma-loaded over time.
Thank you. And Mr. Baker, I really don't have time to ask a question, but I want to once again congratulate you and thank you for your testimony. I remember the first time we had a hearing on the Runaway and Homeless Youth Act, and we had a young man named Robbie who had come through our Safe Place program in Louisville, Kentucky, and he had everybody in the room in tears because his story was so inspirational, and yours is as well. So once again, let me thank the subcommittee for allowing me to participate. And as someone who serves the district where Safe Place was started and is now the home for National Safe Place headquarters, I'm very, very proud to be a part of this effort. So thanks again, and I yield back.
Thank you. That's the end of our of our questioning. Thank you all for your time. I remind my colleagues that pursuant to the committee practice, materials for submission for the hearing record must be submitted to the committee clerk within 14 days following the last day of the hearing, preferably in Microsoft Word format. The materials submitted must address the subject matter of the hearing. Only a member of the committee or an invited witness may submit materials for inclusion in the hearing record. Documents are limited to 50 pages each. Documents longer than 50 pages will be incorporated into the record via an internet link that you must provide to the committee clerk within the required time frame. But please recognize that years from now, that link may no longer work. And now, without objection, I'd like to enter into the record a research brief from Chapin Hall detailing that a comprehensive study of the national prevalence of youth homelessness showed that 4.2 million youth experience homelessness each year. A report from the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness, summarizing what the federal government knows about the scale of youth homelessness and identifying the gaps in robust data on youth homelessness. a guide from the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness summarizing strategies and promising practices for ending youth homelessness, and a report from the U.S. Government Accountability Office on child well-being showing that homelessness has increased among students and families in recent years. Again, I want to thank the witnesses for their participation. Without objection to myself? Without objection? So ordered. Again, I want to thank the witnesses for their participation today. What we have heard is very valuable. Members of the committee may have some additional questions for you, and we ask the witnesses to please respond to those questions in writing. The hearing record will be held open for 14 days in order to receive those responses. I remind my colleagues that pursuant to committee practice, witness questioning for the hearing records must be submitted to the majority committee staff or committee clerk within 7 days. The questions submitted must address the subject matter of this hearing. I now recognize the distinguished ranking member for his closing statement.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and thank you all for coming here today and sharing your stories and thoughts on runaway and homeless youth. You all confirm the sad reality that homeless youth face grave dangers. I'm happy to hear about your efforts to help keep these children safe. What we know is that this work continues and that it is critical to engage many partners in the work to bring these children home and help keep them home. I particularly appreciated hearing about various facets of work to help save these children, including the efforts undertaken by the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. The work they do when a child goes missing is critical and is a vital part of the system to provide help to protect runaways and homeless children. The service with our other witnesses are equally important to saving these children. And finally, without good data, we can't properly assess our work and know what works. All these parts combine to help protect children, and I want to thank you again for all the work that you do. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. I now recognize myself for the purposes of making a closing statement. Today's hearing made clear to the members of this subcommittee that youth homelessness is a pervasive issue that demands our attention. Congress has a responsibility to ensure all children and youth have access to stable housing. As our witnesses shared, youth homelessness is not only an urgent public health crisis facing millions of youth across the country, it is a threat to the safety and development of our country's future. Without stable housing, far too many young Americans cannot access the resources and support that are so crucial to excelling in school, staying safe from horrific abuse and sexual exploitation, and learning to live self-sufficient and independent lives. Importantly, today's hearing also confirmed that youth homelessness is not experienced equally across all communities. Systemic discrimination throughout our society subjects children in underserved communities to a significantly higher risk of suffering the long-lasting consequences of youth homelessness. As our witnesses shared, family disputes, abuse, and experience with the juvenile justice and foster systems push LGBTQ youth and Black and Latino youth into homelessness at disproportionately higher rates. Young parents are also more likely to face homelessness, putting not only themselves at risk, but also their young infants and toddlers whose lives are just starting. After hearing what our witnesses had to say, I do not think anyone disagrees that Congress must update and improve federal policy to help eliminate youth homelessness. Drawing from our discussions today, I look forward to working with each of my colleagues to pass the bipartisan reauthorization of the Runaway and Homeless Youth Act we so urgently need. We need a reauthorization that meets the needs of young adults by extending the length of time youth can stay in basic center programs and prioritize family engagement when it is in the best interest of the youth. We need a reauthorization that centers trauma-informed practices to effectively serve and support youth who have been victims of abuse, trafficking, or sexual exploitation. And we need a reauthorization that ensures that young people, no matter where they find shelter, do not face discrimination or abuse based on their age, race, religion, gender identity, or sexual orientation. I hope that all of us here can work together to realize these priorities and take long overdue steps to ensure that no child in this country endures the trauma and uncertainty of youth homelessness. Our nation's children deserve no less. Thank you all for your time here today. If there's no further business, without objection, the committee stands adjourned.